The clock ticked closer to midnight as I sat in my car, engine idling, in the middle of nowhere. It had been a long drive and I hadn't planned to end up here, but something about the deserted stretch of road and the oppressive silence in the air felt wrong. Like the world was holding its breath. It had all started earlier that evening. My best friend Mark had invited me to a New Year's Eve party at a remote cabin. It was supposed to be a small, intimate affair, just a few friends, drinks, and a roaring fireplace to usher in the new year. I'd agreed without hesitation. Mark had a knack for throwing unforgettable parties, and I was overdue for some fun. The directions he gave me were oddly specific. Take Route 39 until the old gas station, turn left onto the dirt road, and keep driving until you see the cabin. Don't use GPS, it doesn't work out there. He'd laughed when I questioned him. Trust me, it'll be worth it. But as I drove deeper into the woods, the darkness thickened like ink, swallowing the moonlight. Trees loomed on either side of the narrow dirt road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. My headlights barely pierced the gloom, and I began to feel like I was the only person left in the world. That's when I saw the figure. A woman stood at the edge of the road, her back to me. She was dressed in a tattered coat, her hair matted and tangled, hanging in limp strands around her shoulders. She didn't move as my car approached, didn't even flinch as the headlights washed over her. I slowed to a stop, my heart pounding. For a moment I considered rolling down the window to call out, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she stood, unnaturally still, or the icy dread that seeped into my chest as I watched her. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, so I did. A few minutes later, I reached the cabin. It looked inviting enough, warm light spilling from the windows, smoke curling from the chimney. Mark greeted me at the door with a grin, a beer in hand. You made it. I was starting to think you'd bailed. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease. Saw someone on the road, I said casually. Looked like a woman, kind of off. Mark's smile faltered for a split second before he shrugged. Probably just one of the locals. They're harmless. Come on, let's get you a drink. Inside, the cabin was everything I'd imagined, cozy and inviting, with a fire crackling in the hearth and laughter echoing from the small group of people gathered in the living room. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, charged with an undercurrent of unease. As the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. It was little things at first, a shadow that didn't seem to belong, a door creaking open on its own. I chalked it up to my imagination, the lingering effects of my unsettling encounter on the road. Then, just before midnight, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and the laughter died abruptly. Someone cursed, fumbling for their phone's flashlight. Mark tried to lighten the mood. Relax, it's probably just the breaker. I'll check it out. He disappeared into the back room, leaving the rest of us huddled in the flickering glow of phone screens. Minutes passed, then more. Mark didn't return. I'm going to find him, I said, grabbing my own phone for light. The others didn't protest, their faces pale and drawn. I found Mark in the basement, standing perfectly still in front of the breaker box. His back was to me, his shoulders rigid. Mark? I called softly, the word barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, my unease turning to outright fear. Mark, are you okay? Slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes were wide and glassy, his face slack, as if he were in a trance. But it was his hands that froze me in place. They were covered in blood, dark and glistening, and he was holding a piece of paper. He thrust it toward me, his lips moving soundlessly. Trembling, I took it and unfolded it. Scrawled across the paper in shaky handwriting were the words, "She's here. Don't look at her." Before I could react, a bone-chilling scream echoed from upstairs. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the voice. It was one of the girls from the party. I bolted back up the stairs, Mark trailing behind me, his movements jerky and unnatural. The living room was chaos. Furniture was overturned, the front door hung open, and the remaining guests were gone. All except for one, A girl crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering under her breath. I approached her cautiously. What happened? Where is everyone? She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. She took them, she whispered. She said it's almost midnight. Who? I demanded, my voice rising. Her answer was drowned out by a sound that made my stomach drop, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the porch. My gaze snapped to the open door. The woman from the road was standing there, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, a wide, toothy grin stretching across her face. Midnight struck. The last thing I remember was her stepping inside, the world dissolving into darkness, and a voice in my ear, cold and hollow. Happy New Year. I woke up alone in the car, parked by the side of the road. The cabin was gone. No sign of Mark, no sign of anyone. Just the endless stretch of empty forest and the faint sound of laughter echoing in the distance. To this day, I don't know what happened, but every New Year's Eve, I lock my doors and pray she doesn't find me again. It started as an ordinary New Year's Eve. I was never one for the wild, overcrowded parties my friends seemed to love, so I planned for a quiet night at my family's cabin upstate. It's tucked away in a small clearing deep in the woods, the kind of place you go to escape, not celebrate. I packed a few beers, some snacks, and my favorite vinyl records. A solo countdown to Midnight Under the Stars sounded perfect. The drive was uneventful, but as I approached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The woods, usually alive with the occasional rustle of animals or the whisper of wind through the trees, were eerily silent. Even the crunch of snow beneath my boots felt muted as I walked up to the door. Inside, everything was just as I left it last summer. The old wooden floors creaked under my steps as I unpacked. I set up a fire, opened a beer, and put on some music. By 10 p.m., I was fully immersed in the cozy solitude I'd been craving. Then came the first knock. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire. I paused, listening intently. Another knock followed, this time louder, more insistent. I frowned. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen another car or even fresh tracks in the snow. "Hello?" I called, stepping cautiously to the door. My voice sounded small against the weight of the silence outside. No answer. I opened the door a crack and peered out. Nothing but darkness and snow. The moonlight barely pierced through the dense trees. I closed the door, locking it this time, and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was a branch or some animal. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned back toward the fire, I froze. The music had stopped. The record player's needle was still, as if someone had lifted it. A chill ran down my neck. I swore I'd left it playing. I walked over and reset the needle, but before the first note could play, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. My breath fogged in the sudden cold. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the narrow beam slicing through the black. I told myself it was just a blown fuse, but the cabin suddenly felt different, oppressive, like I wasn't alone. I headed to the breaker box in the back hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached for the panel, I heard it again. A knock, louder this time, almost frantic. My hand hesitated. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. Still no answer. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept back to the front door and yanked it open. The cold hit me like a wall, but the porch was empty. Only my footprints marked the snow. I slammed the door shut, my mind racing. Was someone playing a prank? How could they vanish so quickly? As I turned, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. These were larger, heavier, and they led from the doorway to the center of the living room. My flashlight beam trembled as I followed the trail. They stopped abruptly in the middle of the room, as if whoever, or whatever had made them, had vanished into thin air. The air felt electric, heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. I backed away slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, like the wind through the trees, but soon growing louder. They seemed to come from all around me, an unintelligible cacophony of voices overlapping and echoing in the confined space. I spun in place, the flashlight darting across the room, but there was no one there. "Stop it!" I shouted, but the voices only grew louder, more frantic. Then, as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The silence was deafening. My phone buzzed in my hand, nearly making me drop it. A notification. It was a message from an unknown number. 4 words. "Turn around. Don't run." My blood ran cold. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I turned. The flashlight illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the beam. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. It didn't move. Neither did I. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, with a shuddering breath, I aimed the light directly at it. The beam flickered and died. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the door. The air grew colder and the whispers returned, louder than ever, now laced with a guttural growl. My hand found the doorknob and I yanked it open, throwing myself into the snow. I ran. The freezing air burned my lungs, but I didn't dare stop. The whispers followed, relentless, growing closer with every step. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted toward my car, parked just beyond the clearing. I reached it, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas. The tires skidded on the icy road, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. In the rearview mirror, the cabin grew smaller, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. But just as I turned onto the main road, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the clearing, watching me. Its glowing eyes burned into my memory. I didn't stop until I reached the city. Even then, I didn't feel safe. Something followed me out of those woods that night, something I can't explain. Every New Year's Eve since, I've stayed surrounded by people, bright lights, and noise. But no matter where I am, I still hear the whispers, and I know it's waiting for me. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. New Year's Eve had always been my favorite holiday. The fireworks, the laughter, the feeling of hope for a fresh start. But this year was different. It's a night I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. My friend Mark had invited a small group of us to his family's cabin deep in the woods. It was the perfect spot to escape the city and ring in the new year with a quiet, cozy party. Or at least that was the plan. The cabin was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors, a roaring fireplace, and just enough isolation to make you feel like you were in another world. There were 6 of us: Mark, his girlfriend Sophie, my best friend Tyler, his sister Claire, a guy named Jason I didn't know well, and me. We arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered forest in hues of gold and pink. The first few hours were perfect. We played board games, drank too much spiked cider, and laughed until our sides hurt. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, an uneasy feeling settled over me. It started with small things. The way the wind howled like a wounded animal, the flickering of the old cabin lights, the strange static that interrupted the music playing on Mark's Bluetooth speaker. At first, we chalked it up to the cabin's age and the storm brewing outside, but then Sophie noticed something outside the window. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "See what?" Mark asked, wrapping an arm around her. "There was something. Just outside, near the tree line." We all turned to look, but the darkness beyond the frosted window was impenetrable. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and, against our protests, stepped outside to take a look. I followed him, more out of a sense of duty than bravery. The cold bit at my skin as we trudged through the snow, scanning the area with the beam of the flashlight. But there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches. Just an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Probably just a deer," Tyler said, though his voice lacked conviction. We headed back inside, trying to shake off the unease. By the time midnight rolled around, we had almost convinced ourselves it was nothing. We counted down the final seconds of the year, shouting, "Happy New Year," as we clinked glasses. But the joy was short-lived. The lights flickered again and then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. "Relax," Mark said, fumbling for his phone to use as a flashlight. "The power's probably out because of the storm." But then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My stomach churned as I realized it was coming from inside the cabin. Jason was the first to panic, grabbing a poker from the fireplace and shouting, "Who's there?" But there was no answer, just the growling, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Sophie screamed as someone, darted past the doorway to the kitchen. It was too fast to make out any details, but the shadow it cast was massive. "We need to get out of here," Claire said, her voice trembling. "And go where?" Mark snapped. "There's nothing but woods for miles." We decided to stick together and check the rest of the cabin. Armed with makeshift weapons, a kitchen knife, a broken chair leg, anything we could find, we moved as one, our breaths visible in the freezing air. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Each room we checked was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Then we found the basement door. It was slightly ajar, the padlock that had been on it earlier now lying broken on the floor. None of us wanted to go down there, but we couldn't just leave it unchecked. Jason took the lead, gripping his fireplace poker like a lifeline. I was right behind him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The basement smelled of damp earth and rot. The single bulb that lit the space flickered weakly, casting long, twisting shadows. At first we saw nothing but old furniture and boxes of junk, but then we saw it. In the far corner, crouched like some grotesque spider, was a figure. Its limbs were impossibly long, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow in the dim light. It was hunched over, its bony hands clutching what looked like a piece of raw meat. But the smell told me it wasn't animal. Jason let out a strangled cry and swung the poker, but the thing moved faster than I thought possible. One moment it was in the corner, the next it was on him. Its claws tore through him like paper, and the sound of his screams will haunt me for the rest of my life. We ran. God help us. We ran. Back up the stairs, through the living room out into the freezing night. We didn't stop until we reached the cars, but the keys were still inside, and the cabin was no longer empty. Through the windows we could see them. Multiple figures, their yellow eyes glowing in the dark, watching us. We had no choice but to keep running. The forest was a maze of shadows and snow, and every sound, every crunch of a branch, every rustle of the wind, felt like the end. I don't know how long we ran or how we made it back to the main road, but when we finally saw the headlights of an approaching car, I nearly collapsed in relief. The driver, a grizzled old man, didn't ask many questions. He just let us pile into his truck and drove us to the nearest town. When we told the police what had happened, they sent a team to the cabin. But they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just an empty cabin, as if nothing had ever happened. The others try not to talk about that night. Tyler moved to the city and cut off contact with everyone. Sophie and Mark broke up. Claire hasn't been the same since. As for me, I've spent the past year trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just a nightmare brought on by too much cider and an overactive imagination. But every New Year's Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, I hear it. That growl, low and guttural, echoing in the back of my mind. And I know. I know they're still out there, waiting,